All right, hey guys, welcome to Unit 4 Congress Lecture 6, all right? How a bill becomes a law. All right, so I definitely would like you guys to, I'm not collecting it, but do that day 6 study guide for this just because it'll help with the vocab. You're going to think about order, that kind of thing, all right? So, how a bill becomes a law. Let's think about this, just a couple little data things, right? Less than 10% actually pass. So there's a lot of legislation introduced, but very, very, very rarely does or do the stars align perfectly for a bill to become a law, all right? The other thing is ideas for bills originate in the executive branch a lot, which is interesting because the executive branch carries out law. So quite often what this just means is that the executive branch is asking Congress to pass legislation that will let them address some policy problems, right? Remember that we have separation of powers, and so the presidency cannot demand legislation, but they can ask legislation. Now, they can use things like the electronic throne to try to put pressure on Congress to pass legislation that they want, or they can use, the press or the electronic throne. They can use, a catastrophic event to generate support for legislation to pressure Congress. But again, they suggest it. Now, the other thing about this is, but think about where else bills come from. Yeah, they come from the executive branch, and that's quite often a test question. But a catastrophic event can spur legislation. Some kind of public policy problem can spur legislation. Interest groups can suggest legislation. Members of Congress, trying to represent their constituents will introduce legislation. All right, so it comes from a lot of places. All right. But quite often we see the executive branch asking for legislation to help them tackle or address policy problems, right? And if you think about the Affordable Care Act, regardless of our politics here, the president asked Congress, he ran an election of passing health care legislation. He then asked Congress, he had, I guarantee you, his staff, his people wrote legislation with the hope that Congress would then introduce it and pass it as it was, but then they got their hands on it and tweaked it, which is what we're going to get into, Congress getting their hands on it today. All right. Now, the other thing is this: is that bills can be introduced in either house, except for tax bills, revenue-generating bills. Those have to go to the House of Representatives. All right. Now, but remember, they can be introduced simultaneously in the House or the Senate. They can be introduced in the House first and then the Senate. It just depends on a lot of the issues at that moment or what's going on. Generally, if we have divided government, the President, the House, and the Senate are not going to all be lined up, and therefore, you're not going to see a coordination. But if a political party has unified government with if they own the presidency, if they control the presidency, if they control the House, they control the Senate, what you'll see is the party caucuses will definitely try to get together and say, let's get as much legislation or the ideas that we want through because we control the chambers at this moment, all right? So this process of how a bill becomes law can be just for the House and then the Senate, or just for the Senate and then the House, or both simultaneously. All right? Now, one of the big things that we see in the bold here is that it's really, really hard for a bill to become a law. It's easy to kill a bill, it's easy to change a bill, but to actually get it all the way through is incredibly hard. And again, the framers wanted this kind of deliberate, collaborative, reasoned debate before legislation was passed, right? That was their goal. Now, here's the thing, in 1E, two-step legislative process, authorization and appropriation. Authorization is how a bill becomes law. That's what we're going to cover. The appropriation part just controls the spending. So, again, the example we did in class today is authorization is, a committee, subcommittee will hold hearings on, giving laptops to high school students. They'll pass that, but before that actually gets implemented and handed to the executive branch, the appropriations committee will have to cut checks, actually find the funding for that program. All right? So just know those two things, but know that we're pretty much focusing on the authorization process. All right? Money is always an appropriate gift. That's how I remember the money part. All right. And now again, to pass a bill, you need a simple majority. Simple majority in the committees, simple majority in the subcommittees, simple majority on the floor. All right? Now, so a bill is introduced in the House or the Senate, right? It is then referred, the key word there is referred to a committee that has jurisdiction on that issue. There is something called a multiple referral, which means bills can be referred to multiple committees because they cover issues that committees have jurisdiction on, right? Like in a farming bill, I think we talked about like fertilizer. Like there's subcommittees in the House and the Senate that deal with fertilizer and its impact, on agriculture, its impact on farming, right? But maybe because, fertilizer can be used for like a weapon system or it can be dangerous, maybe they have other committees that also have jurisdiction on that issue. And therefore, there can be multiple referrals, meaning there'll be multiple hearings in committees on the bill, all right? Okay, so you got to get to the right committee. If you go to a committee that members are going to kill it, that could end a bill's life, right? I mean, like we talked about civil rights legislation in the 60s going to committees that had chairs that were Southern House members, right? Southern senators. They're going to not want to necessarily be pro-civil rights legislation. So, the leadership will try to get bills to the committees too, in addition to their jurisdiction, that they feel they'll have the most success with. Or sometimes you'll send a committee or a bill to a committee that that chair will try to kill it and nothing will be done because you don't want it passed. All right? Okay, so it's introduced to committee. The committee can do a number of things. I don't want you to worry about committee actions like 1 through 4. They can vote. The key here, and it's not in the notes, they hold hearings. They'll invite interest groups. They'll invite members of the bureaucracy who are implementing the law later, who have experience implementing the law, right? They'll invite constituents. They'll invite anybody impacted by the legislation, anybody with expertise. They'll invite think tanks, right, who are experts in the area. And the idea behind hearings is to gather information so you can write the best legislation possible. All right? Now, one other thing before it gets to committee is usually these bills are introduced and the author of the bill is introducing them in a way that they would love for it to never be changed. Like it's finished. Like their dream world is it would be passed without ever being touched. But we know it's going to get tweaked along this whole process. The other thing, too, is only a member of the House can introduce legislation to the House, and only a member of the Senate can introduce legislation to the Senate. Now, it's probably not hard for a Democratic president or a Republican president to find somebody in each chamber to do that for them if they're suggesting it, or interest groups to ask members of Congress to do it, right? Or their constituents to put pressure, all right? Ideally, some things start to come together for you guys, all right? So, we're in committee, all right? They hold hearings before anything, right? Well, they don't always have to hold hearings. It can be referred to a committee and then no hearings are scheduled. That's one of the powers of controlling the agenda in a committee, right? Is that you control the agenda. If you don't schedule committee hearings, then that bill's kind of just sitting there, nothing's happening, right? Okay, so let's assume it's introduced, they hold hearings, they put that on the schedule, and all that information is gathered. They can vote to pass it, they can vote to kill it right then. But during that process, even before they vote to pass it or kill it, they're going to be amending it along the way. It's called a markup session, which you see right here. Right? This is where it's introduced and sent to committee, and they're tweaking it. They're getting their red pens out. They're adding sentences. They're getting sentences, taken out. They're changing wording. Right? It's like a rough draft of a paper that they're editing in the committee. Taking constituents' ideas, taking interest groups' ideas, taking other member of Congress's ideas, caucuses, log rolling, all those things that influence members of Congress that we've talked about in this unit, right? Okay, so, and they're marking it up, right? They're changing it, tweaking it. One of the things you see in there is earmarks. Do me a favor and look up earmarks, all right? Look it up on Wikipedia, Google, whatever, and come knowing what that is. We can add that to the discussion. All right, so, but they tweak it. Then they can vote to kill it, they can vote to pass it. Right? Now, the most frequent fate of a bill is this pigeonholing, which means it's introduced to the chamber, it's then sent to a committee, referred to a committee, or referred to a subcommittee, and then it's placed and set aside. That's a pigeonhole. Most frequent fate. So again, less than 10% of bills become law. All right. So committees have held hearings. They've marked it up. They've tweaked it. They've changed it. They think it's done. And then they're going to report it out. All right? Now, when they report it out, that means it's making its way to the floor so the whole Senate or the whole House can hold a debate on it and vote for yes or no for this legislation, all right? Okay, now, one of the things is in a discharge petition is used in the House usually. If a committee is holding a piece of legislation in, they're not moving it, if you get a majority vote in the House, you can vote for a discharge, which means you force it out of the committee to the floor where action can take place, all right? Now, once it goes introduced into the chamber, given a number, it gets referred to a committee or subcommittee. They hold hearings. Let's say the committee passes it, right? After they marked it up, tweaked it, changed it. It then gets reported out of the committee. In the House, it has to go through the Rules Committee before it goes to the floor. Now, the Rules Committee, like the notes say, is the traffic cop. They say when we're going to have the debate, how long the debate is going to happen, and a couple other things. They also say, they say, each member of House will get 5 minutes to talk. all right? Or they'll get 10 minutes, or they'll get 3 minutes, and it's going to last for 3 days. There's going to be debates on this legislation, all right? Now, if you're a member of Congress and you get 5 minutes, but you don't really care about that specific legislation, somebody does, you can give them a favor and say, you can have my 5 minutes, you can talk for 10 minutes, right? On the floor, on the chamber. We'll look at this in class, all right? Now, the Rules Committee also determines whether the debate on the floor will happen under an open rule or a closed rule. Now, what an open rule means is they're going to have debate, but members of the House can suggest amendments at this point, like additions to the legislation. All right? It's different than a markup session, which happens in committee. Those aren't formal amendments. They're just tweaking it because it's a rough draft. But once it gets to the floor, to add parts to the legislation, you add an amendment. And I think you need a simple majority to get that amendment added. But if the Rules Committee says closed rule, that means you can only vote yes or no for the legislation. No amendments can be added, all right? It's huge to understand that. Those are huge things there with the Rules Committee, all right? And then again, the rules for the floor debate is just simply time, that kind of thing, all right? Open and closed rule are huge, all right? Now, so that can happen. Now, the Senate doesn't have a strong Rules Committee, but it'll still go to the floor, all right? And now, so we've gone from it's introduced, it's referred to a committee, probably referred to a subcommittee, they've held hearings, they've changed the legislation, all that kind of stuff. It gets reported out, and then it's sent to the Rules Committee in the House, or it's just sent to get debated in the Senate, and they both make it to the floor. So the floor is where the whole 100 senators, the whole 435 members of the House, in separate chambers, of course, and it could be at separate times, will hold a big debate about the legislation with the culmination of voting yes or voting no. Also maybe voting to add amendments. In the Senate you can always add amendments as long as you get a majority vote from the members. In the House you can only add amendments if there's an open rule, which is established by the Rules Committee. All right, now let's look at the Senate for a minute. The Senate, right, on the floor, you can filibuster, right? Now we know that just recently the Democrats changed that rule from a 3/5 to cloture to a simple majority for cloture, right? So that's different, right? And again, now the two-track system. So let's say there's a piece of legislation on, weapons, and there's a filibuster. That's one track. But the two-track means other issues can be debated on the floor while this track is blocked. The old school filibuster, you used to have to speak on the floor and control the floor, and once you would stop speaking, the filibuster was over. Nowadays, the party, whoever is doing a filibuster can simply say, I'm filibustering this. Now, they usually start it with a speech, but they can say, I'm still filibustering it. So what the Senate does, if they can't invoke cloture, they just assume that filibuster exists and is stopping anything from happening on that one track. But let's say there's legislation to fund the military on the other track or other issues. They can still work on those issues on the other track. All right? Okay. Now, again, cloture is now changed from, and again, remember this idea the threat of a filibuster is important, right? If you threaten to filibuster, you can get people to change the legislation. Even in committee, if you talk to these committee members, you're like, look, if you guys do this, we will filibuster it. Filibuster can influence without actually using the filibuster, right? Okay. Now, in the Senate, you can add amendments. Now, in the Senate, you can add non-germane amendments, which are non-germane means it's not specifically relevant to the topic that exists the bill. So if there's a banking bill, but you want to add an amendment, say, on abortion, you can do that in the Senate. In the House, they all have to be germane. So if there's a banking bill in the House and it's an open rule, you can only add amendments that are related to banking. Okay? All right. So non-germane riders, they add them as riders, like you're adding them on. Riders to the bill. They're getting a free ride, right? Okay, now, this result of non-germane riders are Christmas tree bills. And what I want you to think about is a plain Christmas tree without any decorations is the legislation. And all the ornaments that people add onto it are those riders, right, that ends up looking like a Christmas tree, decorated. Okay, now, one of the big things with these Christmas tree bills is that this is where a lot of the reciprocity and log rolling we talked about. Where a member of Congress can get little bits of pork barrel projects, little bits of funding, little tax cuts, like things that are beneficial to their constituents, and they'll tell people, look, I'll vote for this legislation, but I want to get this rider or this amendment added to it, to help my constituents, and therefore I'll vote for it, but only with this amendment. So you see a lot of these amendments build up because people are log rolling or reciprocity is happening. They're negotiating to get votes for the bill to pass. You add amendments to it, all right? But again, only Christmas tree bills in the Senate and only non-germane riders in the Senate. All right, now, you also have holds, right? We talked about holds a little bit. Any senator can put a hold on a bill. And again, it used to be for, I just need more time, I'm out of town, I'll be back for the vote, can we wait to vote till I get back? That kind of thing. But it's been used more and more for political purposes where Democrats aren't liking what Republicans are doing and Republicans aren't liking what Democrats are doing, even though they have the votes to pass that legislation. Now, holds can be used to stop legislation, holds can be used to stop treaties, holds can be used to stop nominations, which we'll get into the nominations later, all right? Okay, now, conference committee. So, it's been introduced, it was given a number, it's referred to a committee, probably referred to a subcommittee, there was hearings, it was reported out, it was given a debate date, a debate time by the Rules Committee in the House, open or closed rule, it's sent to the floors. The floors have debate, they can add amendments or not add amendments, they can vote for or against it. Let's assume that they pass. So let's assume a bill passed the House and a bill passed the Senate. Those are very different in language, even though they're the same issue, right? They're both about some agriculture issue. They're both going to have different languages, especially right now because we have Republican House, Democratic Senate. But even if it was DD or RR, they would probably look different because the makeup of each chamber is different. So, it has to have a conference committee. A conference committee comes together, it's a select joint committee, and its job is to take the House version and the Senate version and align the language so it's one bill. Right? Now this is going to be a big fight, right? Usually the makeup of the conference committees are the leadership in the House, the leadership in the Senate, the chairs and ranking members of each committee that worked on that legislation, right? And maybe individual members that are really impacted by that legislation. Conference. So let's assume conference, like bills can die in conference, but let's assume the conference committee of the House and the Senate writes a bill. They send it back to the House and the Senate, but it doesn't go to committee or anything. It just goes right to the floor in which the members vote up or down, yes or no. And it's got to pass. That new version has to pass both chambers. So it could die right there. But let's assume that it passes, it goes from conference, goes back to the House and passes, and the Senate passes. Now they're the same exact version. Now we have checks and balances. Now it can go to the executive branch, right? So the executive branch has a couple options. The president can sign it into law. The president can veto the bill, right? I forbid. And we'll get into veto in just a minute. Or the president can do nothing. All right, so he signs it into law or he vetoes it. If the president vetoes it, Congress needs a 2/3 vote of both houses to override a veto. If they get the 2/3, it becomes law as if he signed it. If they don't get the 2/3, the bill is dead and it's got to be reintroduced and all started over again if they want it, right? Okay, now again, a president can threaten a veto while the legislative process is working, and it can be in the media or it can be behind closed doors more subtly to say, look, if you guys send me legislation that does that, I will veto it. And usually they do it behind closed doors, like they send staffers talking to each other. They talk to each other. But if they're both not listening to each other, you'll see a president go to the electronic throne in the media and say, listen, these guys are passing legislation I don't agree with, I will veto it, but I need these changes made to it. All right? Okay. So, now, what if the president, if the president signs it, it becomes law, then it's given to the executive branch where they start implementing it. We'll talk about that later. All right? And then Congress's power on that is oversight, right? And he vetoes it, we just did the veto. Now, what if he does nothing? Here's the deal. If the president does nothing, in 10 days, it becomes law. Right? Unless the term of Congress ends within that 10 days. Does that make sense? So if the president does nothing, just sits there, like the bill's not moving forward, right? So what the Constitution says is within 10 days, it becomes law. All right? As if he had signed it. It's called a pocket veto, right? Well, the idea is a pocket veto. If the president does nothing and the 10-day Congress ends, the 113th Congress ends before that 10 days is up, that bill is dead as if the president had vetoed it, and it's a pocket veto. Now, the reason the framers put in 10 days is you can't just have the president say, well, I'm just not going to sign it and do nothing. Because a veto, they can take an action. He signs it, it becomes law. But if you just do nothing, then you can delay, and it never goes into effect. But the idea there is, it forces some kind of action. Either sign it, you veto it, you do nothing. But if you do nothing, it then becomes law after 10 days. Unless the term of Congress ends within those 10 days, and then it's been pocket vetoed, and it dies. All right, now, here's another thing. The line item veto. Presidents have to veto the whole legislation, right? So they can like 90% of it, but if they hate 10%, they still have to veto the whole thing. All right? So in the 90s, President Clinton, and a lot of executives have asked for this, well, they wanted the line item veto where they could say, look, I love all this bill, but I just want to get rid of this part. So I veto that part. Now, Congress would have the ability to override that line item veto if it existed. But in Clinton v. New York, the Supreme Court said this violates the separation of powers because if Congress's job is to write law, The executive branch's job is to carry out law. And so what they're saying is by allowing a president to change part of legislation, he was acting legislatively because he was changing the flavor of the law or the intent of the law, and therefore it violates separation of powers, because in separation of powers, it's Congress that writes the law, right? Okay. Now, Clinton v. New York, another court case, right? So line item veto doesn't exist. It did for a short period until somebody challenged its constitutionality, and it was taken down, all right? Now, most governors have line item veto. That's up to the state. That's another example of federalism, all right? All right, homies, that was how a bill becomes law. Study that, watch this, do the study guide. We'll do a little card sorting class about the process, then we'll go research our debate, okay? All right, bye.